The cabin door had just closed when a man's commanding voice shattered the tension. "Is this how your airline treats its passengers?" His words hung in the air, silencing the whispers and judgmental stares aimed at a young girl standing awkwardly in the first-class aisle. Moments earlier, she had been humiliated by the flight attendant for daring to sit in first class, her modest clothes and frayed backpack branding her, in their eyes, as someone who didn't belong. What none of them knew, however, was that the man speaking was Arthur Graham, a close friend of the airline's founder, and that the girl they dismissed so quickly was the founder's own granddaughter. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is as you tune in. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to support the channel. We bring you stories like this to inspire and surprise you. Now, let's see how this jaw-dropping event unfolded. The air inside the cabin was electric with tension. It wasn't the kind of buzz you'd expect before takeoff, the hushed excitement of travelers ready to escape or arrive somewhere new. No, this was a different kind of energy, uncomfortable, judgmental, and thick enough to choke on, and it was all because of her. I hadn't expected anything like this when I boarded the flight to Chicago. For me, it was supposed to be a straightforward trip. I work in finance, traveling often between cities for meetings and conferences. This time, I was headed to a multi-day event that promised long hours of presentations and networking. I'd upgraded to a first-class seat, not out of indulgence, but because I desperately needed some rest after weeks of non-stop travel. My plan was simple: sink into the leather seat, maybe sip some wine, and zone out for a few hours. Instead, I found myself watching a situation unfold that I couldn't ignore. She was standing just a few rows ahead of me, her slim frame almost swallowed by the oversized faded jean jacket she wore. Her sneakers were scuffed, the soles peeling slightly at the edges, and her backpack, frayed at the seams, was slung over one shoulder like an afterthought. She looked young, probably no older than 18, with a nervous but determined expression on her face. Her cheeks were flushed, and she clutched her boarding pass tightly like it was a lifeline. It wasn't her appearance that caught my attention, though. It was the way people around her reacted. Passengers exchanged glances, some muttering quietly, others openly staring. I heard snippets of whispered comments. Did she wander into the wrong cabin? And maybe she's lost. The atmosphere felt heavy, judgmental, as if the very sight of her in first class was some kind of mistake. The flight attendant, a polished woman with an air of cool efficiency, was the first to voice what the others were silently thinking. "Miss," she said, her tone clipped, "this section is for first-class passengers only." The girl blinked, startled but not entirely surprised. She held out her boarding pass, her hands trembling slightly. "I know," she said softly. "This is my seat." The attendant barely glanced at the pass before shaking her head. "First-class seating is reserved for premium passengers," she said, her words slow and deliberate, as if speaking to a child. "You must be mistaken." I could feel the tension building in the cabin, the weight of all those eyes on the girl. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other but didn't back down. "This is my seat," she said, louder this time. "My grandfather bought it for me." The attendant's lips curled into a faint, condescending smile. "Your grandfather bought you a first-class ticket?" she repeated, her tone dripping with disbelief. "Right. Well, unless your grandfather owns this airline, I'm going to have to ask you to move to the appropriate section." I clenched my fists in frustration, the unfairness of it all gnawing at me. She had presented her boarding pass, clearly stating her seat, and yet she was being questioned, humiliated even, because of how she looked. I didn't know her story, but it didn't matter. No one deserved to be treated like this. The girl's cheeks turned a deeper shade of red, but her voice didn't waver. "He does," she said simply. Her words hung in the air, and I saw several passengers exchange incredulous looks. It sounded absurd, too absurd to be true. But the girl didn't flinch, didn't offer any further explanation. She just stood there, waiting. The flight attendant narrowed her eyes, clearly unconvinced. "Let's confirm that with the gate agent," she said, motioning for the girl to step aside. The girl hesitated for a moment, then nodded stiffly and moved back into the aisle. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she were trying to maintain some semblance of dignity despite the humiliation burning on her face. I could feel her discomfort, her frustration, and a flicker of something else. Determination, maybe? It was hard to tell. The attendant shot her a triumphant look before striding off toward the front of the plane to fetch the gate agent. The girl stood in place, her boarding pass still clutched tightly in her hand. I wanted to say something to tell her she didn't deserve this, but the words caught in my throat. I wasn't the only one. Everyone else in the cabin seemed content to watch in silence, their gazes a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment. I glanced around, hoping to see someone stand up for her, but no one moved. The man next to me leaned toward his companion and whispered something, the faintest smirk playing on his lips. Across the aisle, a woman shook her head, muttering something I couldn't quite make out. And then there was me, silent, just like the rest of them. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't bring myself to speak up. What would I even say? What could I say that wouldn't sound out of place, like I was overstepping? The moment felt too charged, too fragile, and I let it pass. The gate agent arrived a few minutes later, a young woman with an anxious expression. She took the girl's boarding pass, examining it closely. The seconds stretched on like hours as everyone in the cabin watched, waiting for confirmation. Finally, the gate agent nodded. "The ticket is valid," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "She's in the correct seat." A wave of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. "Well," the flight attendant said, her voice sharp, "just because the ticket is valid doesn't mean she belongs here." The words hit like a slap, loud enough to make me wince. I saw the girl stiffen, her shoulders tensing as she struggled to keep her composure. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind that made you want to sink into your seat and disappear. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, what I was watching, and yet I stayed silent, paralyzed by the weight of the moment. And then he appeared. At first I didn't notice him. My focus had been on the girl, and it wasn't until heads started turning that I realized something, or someone, was cutting through the tension. A man was striding down the aisle, his steps purposeful, his presence commanding. He was tall, with a silver beard neatly trimmed to match the immaculate gray suit he wore. There was something about him that felt different, important. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but sharp enough to silence the whispers in the cabin. I sat up straighter in my seat, my attention fully on him now. I didn't know who he was, but it was clear he wasn't just another passenger. The flight attendant seemed to realize it too, her confident demeanor faltering as she turned to face him. "No, sir," she stammered. "We were just confirming." The man raised a hand, silencing her instantly. "Confirming what exactly?" he asked. His eyes flicked to the girl, Eliza, and then back to the attendant. His voice hardened. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're questioning her place here." The cabin had grown quiet again, but the tension lingered like a faint echo. I couldn't stop glancing at the man who had just silenced the room with a single question. His commanding presence and piercing gaze had left the flight attendant visibly shaken, her earlier arrogance evaporating into thin air. The girl, Eliza, was now seated, her posture still stiff, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. I didn't know much about her yet, but there was something about her that drew my attention. She had been humiliated in front of an entire cabin of strangers, yet she had stood her ground. She hadn't yelled, cried, or lashed out. She had endured it with a quiet strength that, to me, spoke volumes. The man, who had introduced himself as Arthur Graham, returned to his seat beside her. I hadn't realized before, but he must have been sitting just one row behind me before all of this began. Now, he leaned toward her, his expression softening as he said something I couldn't quite hear. Eliza nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly as he spoke. There was a quiet understanding between them, the kind that comes with deep trust. I felt compelled to know more. Who was this girl, and why had he stepped in so fiercely to protect her? It wasn't just because of the injustice. There was something personal in the way he had defended her, something deeper. It didn't take long for me to pick up bits and pieces of their conversation. Sitting just a row ahead, I could hear snippets of Arthur's reassuring tone and Eliza's hesitant replies. Her voice was quiet, almost timid, but I caught enough to start piecing the story together. "Didn't know, Grandpa never told me," she murmured, her words laced with a mix of confusion and disbelief. Arthur chuckled softly, his tone warm but firm. "Of course he didn't. Henry wanted you to grow up away from all of this," he said. "He wanted you to have a normal life, free from the weight of the family name. But now that you're 18, things are going to change." I felt my chest tighten at the revelation. Her grandfather was Henry Carson, the founder of Carson Air, the very airline we were flying on. It was starting to make sense now. The ticket, the intervention, the quiet authority with which Arthur had handled the situation, it all pointed to the fact that this girl wasn't just anyone. She was part of something much bigger. But then, why didn't she act like it? Most people in her position, someone tied to immense wealth and influence, would carry themselves with a certain air of entitlement, if not arrogance. Eliza, however, was the opposite. Her clothes were plain, her demeanor shy, and she seemed utterly unaware of her own importance. As if to confirm my thoughts, Arthur leaned closer to her and added, "You didn't grow up with the Carson name for a reason, Eliza. Your grandfather wanted you to understand the value of hard work, to live simply and make your own way. That's why he sent you abroad to study. He didn't want you to feel like you were handed everything in life." Eliza nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to her lap. "I guess I just didn't realize it would feel this overwhelming," she admitted. "I mean, I always wondered why Grandpa could afford my tuition abroad, but I thought it was just savings or something. I never imagined." She trailed off, shaking her head as if trying to process the weight of what she'd just learned. Arthur reached over, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's a lot to take in," he said gently, "but you're stronger than you think, Eliza, and this trip is just the beginning. Your grandfather has big plans for you, but you don't need to worry about that right now. All you need to do is focus on being yourself. The rest will fall into place." I felt a pang of guilt listening in on such a private conversation, but I couldn't look away. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and what I was learning only made me admire Eliza more. She wasn't some entitled heiress pretending to fit in. She was a young woman who had been raised far from the privileges of her family's wealth, navigating a world she didn't fully understand yet. And this flight? This was her first step into that world. As the plane taxied toward the runway, I found myself reflecting on Arthur's role in all of this. He wasn't just a family friend, that much was obvious. The way he spoke to Eliza, the way he had stepped in so decisively, it was clear he was more than just a passive observer. He had been sent here for a reason. It wasn't until later in the flight that I overheard another key detail, one that tied everything together. Arthur was speaking softly to the flight attendant. Yes, the same one who had caused all the trouble earlier. She had returned to offer him an apology, her posture stiff with embarrassment. "Mr. Graham," she began, her voice low, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I shouldn't have—" Arthur waved a hand, cutting her off. "What's done is done," he said. "But let this be a lesson to you, and to everyone on this plane. Judgments made too quickly are almost always wrong." The attendant nodded quickly, retreating without another word. Arthur sighed, shaking his head before turning back to Eliza. "Your grandfather wanted to be here himself," he said, his voice soft again. "But you know how he is. Work never stops. So he sent me instead. Told me to keep an eye on you just in case." Eliza smiled faintly. "You didn't have to do all that," she said. "I would have been fine." Arthur raised an eyebrow, his expression somewhere between amusement and skepticism. "You say that now," he said, "but it's better to be safe than sorry. The world isn't always kind, Eliza. People will judge you, test you, try to tear you down the moment they sense you're different. And when that happens, it's important to know how to handle yourself." Eliza nodded thoughtfully, her gaze distant as she stared out the window. "I guess I still have a lot to learn," she murmured. "You do," Arthur agreed, "but you're already on the right path, and you'll have your grandfather and me every step of the way." The rest of the flight passed uneventfully, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had witnessed. Eliza wasn't just another passenger. She was a girl caught between two worlds, one of simplicity and one of immense power and responsibility. And as much as Arthur and her grandfather wanted to guide her, it was clear that she was determined to navigate that path on her own terms. The plane had just landed, and the cabin filled with the soft clicks of seatbelts unbuckling. People reached for their bags and prepared to disembark, but I lingered in my seat, watching as Arthur and Eliza gathered their things. There was something magnetic about them, Arthur's composed authority and Eliza's quiet strength. The weight of everything I had witnessed on this flight still sat heavily on my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a regular journey for them. It was the start of something much bigger. As they moved toward the exit, I noticed the flight attendant standing near the galley, her posture unusually rigid. She didn't have the brisk confidence she'd carried earlier. Instead, there was a carefulness in the way she watched Eliza and Arthur walk by, almost as if she was bracing for judgment. When Arthur passed her, he paused briefly, leaning in to speak to her quietly. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw her nod, her expression subdued, almost apologetic. Arthur's voice was calm, measured, not angry, but firm. Whatever he said left her standing there with her head slightly bowed as they exited the cabin. I thought that was the end of it, but as I gathered my own things and prepared to leave, I noticed something else. A different flight attendant, clearly senior to the first, was speaking to the gate agent just outside the cabin. She held a clipboard in her hand, her expression serious. As I stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge, I caught part of their conversation. "Already reported to management," the senior attendant was saying. "This won't happen again. We're implementing additional training immediately. It's unacceptable." The gate agent nodded quickly, jotting something down. Their voices trailed off as I continued down the jet bridge, but the few words I'd heard told me enough. Whatever had happened on this flight wasn't going to be ignored. The airline was taking it seriously, and changes were already in motion. When I reached the terminal, my phone buzzed with a notification from the airline. It was one of those automated customer surveys asking for feedback about my flight. Normally, I would have dismissed it without a second thought, but this time, I paused. I clicked the link and scanned the questions, but it wasn't the usual generic form. Near the bottom, a new section caught my eye. "Did you witness any incidents during your flight where a passenger was treated unfairly? If so, please provide details below. We are committed to improving our service and addressing issues promptly." I stared at the screen for a moment, impressed by the addition. It was subtle, but it showed me that the airline wasn't just brushing things under the rug. They were actively seeking ways to do better. I filled out the form, describing the incident as objectively as I could. I mentioned how Eliza had been treated, how Arthur had stepped in, and how the flight attendant's behavior had impacted the atmosphere in the cabin. But I also acknowledged the senior attendant's swift response and the visible steps being taken to address the issue. It felt good to know my feedback might contribute to real change. As I walked through the terminal, I spotted Arthur and Eliza again. They were standing near the baggage carousel, talking quietly. Eliza's posture was more relaxed now, her expression brighter. She laughed at something Arthur said, the sound light and genuine. Watching them, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure, not just for them, but for myself. This flight had been an unexpected journey, not just for Eliza, but for me as well. It had forced me to confront my own biases, to reconsider how I viewed the people around me. Eliza had been tested in a way that most of us would have struggled to endure, and she had come out stronger for it. And Arthur had shown me what it meant to be a true leader, not just in title, but in action. As they walked away, I felt a quiet sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the lesson I hadn't expected to learn, and for the reminder that every person has a story worth hearing. The world is full of assumptions, but it's also full of opportunities to challenge them, to be better, kinder, more understanding. When I finally reached the exit, I glanced down at my phone one last time. The airline survey still sat open, waiting for me to submit it. With a small smile, I pressed send. And just like that, the story of Flight 347 became one I would carry with me long after I left the terminal.